All right, let's dive into a concept that's fascinated philosophers for ages. Divine illumination. We're going to use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide. It's kind of like shining a light on how we know things, but with a little, divine intervention in the mix.
Yeah, it's really interesting because before we get to the modern era, divine illumination was like the main theory of knowledge. It wasn't just some like side idea. Major thinkers, from Socrates to Augustine, they really wrestled with it.
So it's more than God just creating our minds. Like, are we saying that we need this ongoing special help from something supernatural to really get the world, like divine grace, but for our intellect?
Exactly. It's not just about knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's about like grasping that deeper why behind it or, understanding the true essence of things like justice, beauty, those sorts of things.
Okay, so I'm intrigued, but also a little skeptical. I mean, Socrates was talking about a divine voice guiding him. That sounds a bit mystical for a philosophy deep dive, don't you think?
Well, I mean, keep in mind the ancient Greeks, they saw the divine in like everything. And even if we take that divine sign of Socrates, kind of metaphorically, it still points to this idea that knowledge might come from somewhere beyond just our own reasoning. And this idea kind of resonates with Plato too, right?
You're thinking about his theory of recollection, where we're like remembering knowledge from a past life. I've always found that one a little hard to swallow.
It does sound a little, out there, I'll admit it. But the idea that we're born with some like innate knowledge, some kind of pre-life glimpse of these perfect forms, it hints at this like primordial illumination, a seed of divine understanding that's just like planted in us. And even Aristotle, who was way more, grounded in the physical world, he's got this concept of like the active intellect.
Yeah, that's one I've always struggled with. What exactly is Aristotle getting at with this active intellect? Is it divine? Is it a part of us?
It's really tricky, and scholars are still debating exactly what he meant, but some interpret it as like this divine element that participates in our thinking. It allows us to grasp those universal, unchanging truths that go beyond just our senses. So even in Aristotle, who we usually think of as like the father of logic and reason, there's this hint of something, like something more.
Okay, so we've got these ancient philosophers invoking gods, whispers of divine inspiration. But then Augustine comes along and he puts divine illumination, like, really on the map, right?
Absolutely. Augustine takes this idea and makes it like central to Christian thought. And he goes beyond the idea of God just like handing us information. He argues that God illuminates our minds so we can actually see the truth ourselves. It's like God switching on a light bulb in our understanding. And he even uses this metaphor in his Confessions of God like lighting our lamp.
Okay, I like that metaphor. So for Augustine, it's not like getting divine downloads. It's our minds being empowered to actually, like, perceive truth. Especially those big eternal truths that we just can't get with our senses alone, right? Like, truths from the Bible or the ideas of justice and beauty.
Exactly. And this kind of brings up a really important question, right? What kinds of truth need illuminating? For Augustine, it was those that go beyond the physical world, those like unchanging, eternal truths our senses can't grasp. But what about the truths we learn through experience, through reasoning? Do we need divine help for those too?
Good question. Because if we follow Augustine's logic, it seems like we'd need that divine help for, like, almost everything.
And that's the debate that kind of consumes these medieval philosophers for centuries. As Aristotle's ideas, they gain some traction, it becomes a real like philosophical showdown. On one side, you got the Augustinians arguing we need divine illumination for any deep knowledge. And then on the other, you got the Aristotelians. They think our minds have a natural, God-given capacity for understanding.
So it's like two teams facing off in this philosophical arena, and we need like a good play-by-play commentator to, guide us through all the arguments.
Well, think of the Stanford Encyclopedia as our commentator, giving us like ringside seats to this intellectual battle. And what's really remarkable is how nuanced these debates were. We're not talking about like simple theological pronouncements. These thinkers were dissecting the mind, the role of our senses, the possibility of certainty, like all this really deep stuff.
So let's get into the thick of it, right? First up, the 13th century Franciscans, they were like big Augustine fans, yeah.
Yeah, figures like Bonaventure, they were staunch defenders of illumination. They argue that our minds and like the physical world, they're in constant flux. So the only way to get to true certain knowledge is through God's unchanging eternal mind. Like God's mind is the ultimate anchor for truth, and illumination is like the rope that ties us to it.
Okay, I see how that would be appealing to someone, wanting certainty in a world that often feels so chaotic. But wait a minute, weren't there some dissenting voices, even among the Franciscans?
You're right. The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions Peter John Olivier. He raised some really serious doubts about the whole thing, but he didn't just like reject the theory outright. He presented all these insightful challenges. Like he was trying to like poke holes in every version of illumination he could think of.
Oh, I like him already. A philosophical troublemaker. So what kind of questions was he asking?
He asked things like, does God illuminate our understanding of species or genera? Like when we see a dog, is God illuminating our idea of that dog? Or like the general concept of dogness. He also asked, if divine illumination is so essential, why do we even need sensory experience at all? It's like he's anticipating the arguments that'll eventually lead to the theory declining.
Wow, he sounds way ahead of his time. So Olivier's stirring things up within the Franciscan camp. What happens next in this philosophical saga?
Well, that's when Thomas Aquinas enters the scene. And he's often seen as the guy who, like, dealt the final blow to divine illumination, but it's more complicated than that.
Ooh, I love when things get complicated. Tell me more.
Aquinas, he was like a master at kind of blending different ideas, trying to bring together, the seemingly different views of Augustine and Aristotle. And he gives a nod to Augustine, acknowledges our ability to grasp truth comes from, ultimately participating in these divine ideas. But he also emphasizes our innate agent intellect.
Okay, hold on a second. Agent intellect. That sounds like something out of like a sci-fi novel. What is Aquinas talking about here?
Think of it like a God-given ability. Lets us understand like fundamental truths without needing constant, supernatural help. Like God gave us the mental software to decode reality.
So instead of God like constantly shining a light on every truth we run into, Aquinas is saying God kind of like front-loaded the illumination, gave us the tools, the capacity to grasp truth ourselves.
Exactly. He kind of shifts the focus from ongoing divine assistance to our like natural cognitive abilities. Of course, Aquinas still believes God is the ultimate source, of our intellect and the world being intelligible, but he thinks we're equipped to do a lot of the work, ourselves.
This is making my head spin a bit, but I think I'm starting to get it. So for Aquinas, divine illumination isn't so much about like constant intervention. It's more about our God-given capacity for understanding. But does that mean he completely throws out the idea of divine illumination?
Not completely. He still sees a role for it, but it's more subtle. He thinks that God illuminates like the objects of our understanding, making them, knowable to us. Like God creates the puzzle, and we, with our God-given minds, we put the pieces together.
Okay, I like that. It helps me understand how Aquinas bridges that gap between, Augustine's emphasis on divine grace and Aristotle, who is all about reason. So where does this leave the theory? Is Aquinas' view the last word on all this?
Not quite. There's this fascinating figure who tries to bring the theory back to life, Henry of Ghent. He comes in after Aquinas, trying to bridge that gap between, Aristotelian naturalism and the Augustinian illumination.
Okay, Henry of Ghent. What's his take on all this?
He argues that we need divine illumination to grasp the true essences of things, like to go beyond just, appearances and understand the deeper nature of reality. So he's accepting that Aristotelian framework, but he believes our natural, like, cognitive abilities, they're limited. We need that extra boost from God to really know.
So he's kind of a middle ground between Augustine and Aquinas.
In a way, yeah. Trying to hold on to the idea that our minds can grasp truth, but not quite ready to let go of that essential role of divine illumination. He still believes there's something, fundamentally mysterious about knowledge, something that needs a supernatural explanation. But then comes a real game changer, John Donne's Scotus.
Okay, Scotus, I'm sensing a turning point here. What did he do to shake things up?
Scotus basically says, hold on a minute. If our minds are so messed up that they need constant divine help just to work right, even God couldn't fix that. It was a pretty devastating blow to the theory of divine illumination as, it had been understood.
Wow, that's a mic drop moment if I ever heard one. So what does Scotus offer instead? Does he just say we can't know anything at all?
No, not at all. Scotus was a big believer in the power of our, natural abilities to think. He argued that we can grasp truth, especially those self-evident truths that are like the foundation of all knowledge. Things like, basic logic, reasoning.
So like the idea that the whole is greater than the part.
Exactly. Scotus thought when we encounter a proposition, a self-evident one like that, our minds just they get it. We don't need God to tell us it's true, that truth is just, right there, inherent in the concepts. Think about what that means.
Okay, I'm thinking it's like Scotus is moving away from like this idea of divine intervention and toward the idea that the world itself is like intelligible. It's structured in a way that, makes it knowable to us.
Exactly. And this is a huge deal because it paves the way for a more naturalistic approach to knowledge. It's like demystifying that process of understanding, removing that need for, constant supernatural help, a huge step towards the scientific revolution.
Wow. I never thought about it that way. So even though he was this, Franciscan monk, Scotus's ideas helped lay the groundwork for a more scientific way of seeing the world. But hold on. Does he ditch God entirely in his theory of knowledge?
He doesn't totally get rid of God. He still believes that God is ultimately responsible for the, intelligibility of the world, for giving things their essence and making them knowable to us. But for Scotus, God's role is to make things capable of being known. It's our job as, rational beings to use our God-given minds to actually do the knowing.
So God creates the playbook, but we're the players on the field, using our skills and intelligence to, figure out the game.
That's a great way to put it. And what's so groundbreaking about Scotus's view is that it opens the door to this whole new era of philosophical inquiry. Philosophers start exploring new ways to explain, how we know things, delving into perception, language, and how our minds connect to the world.
Scotus really shakes things up. But does that mean divine illumination is, like, dead?
Well, it doesn't vanish overnight, but SCOTUS definitely marks a turning point. His ideas have a huge influence, and the theory of divine illumination kind of loses its grip as the dominant explanation for knowledge.
But those questions about knowledge, they don't go away, right?
Of course not. They actually get more complex. Philosophers are grappling with Scotus's naturalism. They start looking for new ways to explain how we know things, going deeper into perception, the role of language, and how mind and world connect.
So it's like Scotus opens these doors to a whole new era of, like, philosophical inquiry.
Exactly. And this exploration, it's still going on today. Philosophers from, all sorts of different backgrounds are still wrestling with these really big questions.
It's amazing how these ideas that seem so abstract from, like, centuries ago still have such a huge impact on how we understand ourselves and, the world. Speaking of impact, what happens after Scotus? Does anyone try to, like, bring back this idea of divine illumination?
Well, it never really disappears completely. The theory in its, classic form may lose its hold, but you can still see echoes of it in the work of later thinkers. The Stanford Encyclopedia mentions some interesting examples like Descartes and Malebranche.
Oh, yeah. Descartes, the I think, therefore I am guy. What does he have to say about divine illumination?
Descartes, he was really into reason and a more scientific approach to knowledge, but he still holds on to some intriguing ideas that kind of resonate with these earlier theories. He talks about, seeds of truth that are planted in our souls by God. He sees these seeds as the basis for our knowledge of first principles.
So it's not like full-blown divine illumination, but there's still this idea that God gives us these fundamental building blocks for our thinking.
Exactly. It's fascinating how Descartes, even as he's pushing the boundaries of modern philosophy, is still thinking about these same questions, that Augustine and Aquinas were struggling with centuries before. Shows just how fundamental these questions are to, being human.
Like we're all standing on the shoulders of these philosophical giants, even as we're trying to, forge our own paths. And then there's Malebranche, who, if I remember right, takes things in a pretty wild direction, right?
Malebranche. Oh, he definitely takes things in a pretty radical direction. He develops this idea that, we see all things in God.
Hold on. So he's saying that God is like this ultimate VR headset. Whoa. That's a pretty wild concept, isn't it?
It's a bold claim for sure, but I think it shows how appealing this idea is, that there's something more to knowledge, more than our senses and reasoning. It hints at this deeper, maybe even mystical dimension to how we connect to the world.
Okay, so we started with Socrates' divine whispers. Then we went to Aquinas' agent intellect. And now we're in this world where we see everything through God's mind. What a trip. But after this whole deep dive into divine illumination, I got to ask, what does it all mean for us today? You know, we're not living in the world of, like, Augustine or Stotus anymore.
That's the question, isn't it? And while we might not be talking about divine illumination in the same way those, medieval philosophers did, there are still some really valuable lessons here.
Like what? Give us some takeaways.
Well, first of all, it reminds us that knowledge, it isn't simple. It's not just passively absorbing information. It's this active thing, engaging with the world, using our senses and reason to make sense of things.
Right? Like, even recognizing a simple truth. It's actually a really complex process. It involves our perceptions, our ideas, and how we connect those ideas to the world.
Exactly. And secondly, I think this deep dive shows us how important intellectual humility is. Even the greatest minds, throughout history, they struggled with these questions about knowledge, and they came up with so many different answers.
So it's okay to question our assumptions, explore different perspectives, and, admit we don't have all the answers.
Totally. And finally, I think the story of divine illumination, it shows us how powerful mystery is. Even with all our, scientific and technological advancements, some things we may just never fully grasp.
Like consciousness, for example, or the origins of the universe, or even the feeling of, like, love or awe.
Exactly. While it's tempting to try to explain away those mysteries, I think there's something beautiful about, recognizing the limits of what we know and embracing that unknown.
So next time I have this, like, sudden flash of insight, maybe it'll be a little divine illumination at work. Or maybe it's just my brain doing its thing. Either way, it reminds me there's still so much out there to discover about the world and about ourselves.
And that's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It's not about finding some final destination. It's this constant journey of questioning, exploring, and expanding our understanding.
Well said. And who knows, maybe somewhere along the way we'll even find a little bit of that divine spark ourselves. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into divine illumination. We hope you've gotten some new insights, or at least some new questions to ponder.
Until next time, keep exploring.